Good morning, good morning, good morning. Welcome, everybody, to the Advent Defense League. Glad you are here. Hope you're doing well. I know that this was a study we were supposed to have yesterday, but fortunately, wasn't able to make it yesterday morning. So we try our best to do these. I try my best to do these studies every Sabbath morning at about, say, 6 o'clock in the morning. And I know it's difficult for most people to get there, but that's the point of doing morning devotionals so that we can get together early in the morning when there's no interruptions, the kids are still sleeping, it's quiet, it's nice and peaceful, so that we can be able to do our Bible studies. Give me a few moments here. I'm just going to check a few things. If you hear me if you hear me well, please type a 1 or say yes. Good morning, Mark. Thank you for being here, my friend. Please let me know if you can hear me well while I just check a couple of things on my side. All right, very good. Welcome, Bobby. Glad you're here. Good morning, good morning. Got my water, did my morning prayer. Last time I did this, somebody said, when you do water, I do coffee. That's fine. But I'm glad you're here nonetheless. I'm glad you joined me. So, we're going to have a word of prayer, but by way of reminder, we're studying Mark chapter 2, and we're actually examining a book that's critical of Seventh-day Adventism, and particularly the doctrine of the Sabbath. This book right here. This was a book written by L.C. Jr. Thunder Larston, and it's a book that has a good amount of criticisms against the keeping of the Sabbath. You can see from the names of the chapters, for example, the Sabbath is not a sign or seal. Sabbath breaking does not preclude entrance into heaven. Sabbath is a Jewish institution. Some of these things most of these I disagree with. Some of them I actually agree with. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings in the book, and I thought I might do a couple of responses to the section in regards to Mark chapter 2, because it seems like some of the arguments there with this particular chapter seem in the surface that it's may come off convincing to some folks. And so I thought, well, here's some arguments I think are worthy of a challenge and a full study. I have written responses to almost every chapter of this book on the Advent Defense League website. Unfortunately, the website is still down. We're still working on getting it back up, but the moment it's up, you'll have access to it and you'll be able to see all those written responses. So we're just doing some responses to the Mark II part, but we have responses. I have responses to almost every chapter actually in that book, and I'm going to be finishing up responses soon, as time permits, as God wills. Welcome, Eric. Thank you for joining us as well. Last time we were studying, just by way of repetition, Mark chapter 2. We did a part 1. Today we're doing a part 2, and then we will be finalizing with a part 3 sometime next week, hopefully on Sabbath again. So let's have a word of prayer, and let's begin our morning devotion. Father in heaven, we're grateful for the opportunity to be here wherever we are, be it home, be it if we're traveling, or at a hotel perhaps because we're doing some business or ministry. Wherever we are around the world listening into this broadcast, I pray that you would bless us with your Holy Spirit as we seek to open up your word and study first thing in the morning so that we can learn of you and be sanctified by thy word. Bless us now with your grace, forgiveness, and understanding by your Spirit. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So let me give you a brief reminder of what we spoke about last time. I'm looking to my right here, just looking at my notes. Now, if you look at the previous video that we did, you will see there the notes from what we looked at. But what we did is we studied the word. We took a brief look at the context. Today we're going to take a deeper look at the context. And then we studied the word man, and we learned that the word man can have, it means man or mankind, and it does depend on the particular context that is being used. And so what we did because of that point, we looked at the context, a brief look at the context, and determined that because it's an allusion to the creation, to the beginning, that therefore the word man there is talking about mankind. We also looked at the Greek man, anthropos, which has a definite article, man, and we learned by way of its connection to creation that man was Adam. And then we learned that Adam, according to a particular text in the book of Acts, that Adam is a representative of the whole human race. One of the apostles, I believe it was, I can't remember who it was, but it's in Acts 17:26, says that of one blood made he all races of men. And so Adam's a representative of mankind. Welcome, Bobby. Thank you for joining us, my friend. And so we have various allusions, various indicators that point to the beginning in Mark chapter 2. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, making him the creator. The parallel chapter in Matthew chapter 12 talks about Jesus being greater than the temple. That makes him God, which makes him the creator. And so we have all these allusions, these pointers to the creation. The word made also points to creation, even though it does depend on context. But nevertheless, in this particular context, we have that word made, which points to the creation. In fact, some translations, instead of putting made, put the word created. What else? We also noticed a very neat parallel between what Jesus said in Mark 2 and the creation account. And for that one, I'll read it. It says here, this is point F in the last video. It says that there's a parallel between verse 27 with the last 2 days of creation week. Jesus says man was not made for the Sabbath, which makes sense because in creation week, man was made on day 6, while the Sabbath was made on day 7. So of course, Jesus would say that man was not made for the Sabbath because the Sabbath didn't yet exist when man was made. And so you have this parallel between man and then Sabbath in the creation account, man and Sabbath in the words of Jesus Christ. So it's a very neat, I won't make a huge theology out of that, but it's a nice piece of evidence you can also point to as well. And so what we're having is a direct point, a couple of pointers or you could say pieces of evidence that point to creation. Jesus is taking a quick detour to creation to make his case that the Sabbath was made to benefit man. And so what man was doing at that moment is justified because philanthropy was always permitted on the Sabbath. In fact, God always did good on the Sabbath. He still provides on the Sabbath, provides, the sun, moon, and stars, life, the breath of air, food. He still provides even on the Sabbath, all 7 days of the week. And so man following in his example would do the same thing. And we looked at a couple of examples of that in the scriptures where the priests did ministry work on the Sabbath, changing of the showbread, things of that nature. We saw Israelite soldiers still working on the Sabbath, protecting the temple. Priests were still, prophets were still doing their prophetic work on the Sabbath. So there are many examples of this in the Old Testament. And so Jesus, like he did with the marriage in Matthew 19:4, he points to the beginning to make his case for the original intent with marriage, which was between a man and a woman, and no divorce. He does that just to make a point, even though the context is not technically about the creation account. And so that's what Jesus is doing in Mark 2. So that's a brief recap of what we looked at, pardon, with Mark chapter 2 last time. Of course, you can go back to that video and take a look at it. But right now we're going back to the context of Mark chapter 2. And I hope you got your Bibles. This is a morning devotional. And again, by way of repetition, this is an opportunity for us to study the scriptures with no interruptions and everybody's still sleeping in the house. And we get to do that. Try to understand these things as best as we can. Going back to Mark chapter 2, now we're going to look at the context a little more than we did the last time. In Mark chapter 2, if you go there in your Bibles, there are two examples And when I say two examples, I mean Mark 2 in comparison to Matthew 11 and 12. Because in Matthew 12, there's a second example. There's the example that Jesus gives in his defense of what the disciples were doing. That example is the example of the priests doing their priestly work. All right. But in chapter 2, though, in Mark, the first example we read is the example of King David. Let's go there, Mark chapter 2. So we're in Mark chapter 2, verse 25. Let me know when you're there by saying amen in the comment section or typing a 1. It says in verse 25 in Mark 2, but he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was in need and hungry? I'm reading from the New King James Version. He and those who were with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest and ate the showbread, which was not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. Let me ask you a question. When David went in and did that, first question is, was he in need? He was in need. Did the Sabbath prohibit doing anything that was to satisfy your need? No. If you read the fourth commandment, the only thing it's prohibiting is anything that has to do with secular work. I had a critic one time say, well, the commandment says all your work, and therefore even good deeds were not permitted. You know, words like all and every need to be studied in their context and compared to the rest of Scripture. God is not contradicting himself when he says that, because then he later in Exodus and Leviticus, he tells the priests that they need to do a work on the Sabbath, their ministry work, right? And so God is not contradicting himself, all in the context of secular work, because he explains it in the commandment. Neither you, nor your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, which also worked their secular work. There's a verse that says not to muzzle the mouth of an ox while he's working, while he's treading, right? And so even animals. It doesn't prohibit anything of necessity or of an emergency or even of ministry. Only your daily secular work that you do, work that was not a part of what God had commanded to be done. God did ministry work on the Sabbath. Every Sabbath, he did ministry work. How do I know? Because even on the first Sabbath in Genesis chapter 2, he did a certain work. Even though he rested from his creation, the Bible says in those texts in Genesis chapter 2 that he completed creating the heavens, the earth, and the sea. So he rested from that. The Bible tells us in Colossians that he continues to uphold things. By him all things consist, the verse says. And so therefore he was still doing a good work, a work that was necessary, a work of sustaining that which he just created. So again, God is the example. So when David did that example was perfect to demonstrate that which was necessary with regards to ministry or emergencies, ministry like the priests, emergencies like in his situation, was necessary, allowed, and legal on the Sabbath day. Let me ask you another question. When David did that, though, the bread that he ate, did it remain sacred? Or did it suddenly stop being sacred? Well, the bread remained sacred. Just because he partook of the sacred bread at that moment under the circumstances he was in, you recall he was running from Saul, who was trying to kill him. Just because he partook of the sacred bread doesn't mean that bread is suddenly no longer sacred. And that's the problem with the critics when they read this particular example. To them, it means that now that David did that, therefore, in essence, that bread is no longer sacred, or we don't have to keep the Sabbath in those types of cases. Therefore, the Sabbath is not really sacred, or was never really sacred, or is no longer sacred. That's not the case. That's not what we're reading. The Sabbath is still sacred, and the bread was still sacred as well. Here's another question. Was David still a Sabbath keeper, and were the priests still observing the ordinance of the showbread? They were still doing it even after that situation. So what are we saying? What are we learning? We're learning that even though under the circumstance this was permitted and legal, That doesn't necessarily mean that the Sabbath was no longer important, nor sacred, nor that it no longer needed to be observed or kept. Some reason when critics read this, it suddenly means to them, oh, now I can mow my lawn on the Sabbath. Now I can go to my secular job on the Sabbath. Now I don't have to observe the Sabbath. But that's not the case. The exception is not the rule. The exception is not the rule, but to the critics it is. The same thing we're seeing in Matthew chapter 12. So if you go to Matthew chapter 12 now, and you're going to notice another example. Matthew chapter 12, and let's go to verse 5 through 6. And again, I'm looking to my right because I'm looking at my notes on my other screen. But those notes are going to be placed inside of the description once this broadcast is done. So you'll be able to see that. Welcome, nice kid. Thank you for joining us, my friend. So now look at this, Matthew chapter 12. And notice what it says, beginning in verse 5. It says, or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath? And we're going to look at that word profane in a moment. Profane the Sabbath and were blameless. I think the profane one is coming in part 3. We'll see. We'll keep that as a cliffhanger. And yet I say to you, in this place there is one greater than the temple. So here we have Jesus giving another example of another work that was necessary. This example is not an example of an emergency like David's situation. Rather, in this example is an example of ministry. In other words, if it comes to an emergency, like in David's case, or ministry work, like in the case of the priests, these two things were the very two things that Jesus was doing on the Sabbath. He was healing on the Sabbath, and he was doing ministry work on the Sabbath. And incidentally, that's the ministry the disciples were involved in at this very situation at the moment that they went ahead and started picking grain from the field. And so in order for them to continue that work, of course, they needed sustenance. They needed to sustain themselves. They needed to eat. And under the situation, what they did was not illegal, but legal on the Sabbath. And so Jesus proves that with these two examples, that what the disciples did was legal because it's similar to what the priests did, and it's similar to the situation that David was in when he partook of the sacred rite. And so now let's ask the same questions that we asked, or similarly, that we asked in regards to the David situation. Number one, remember when we asked, was the bread still sacred? Even though David partook of it, well, yes, the bread was still sacred. The sacredness didn't go away, right? The ordinance was still there for the priest to work to perform this ordinance. Was the Sabbath still sacred, even though the priests did that particular work on the Sabbath? Did it remain sacred? It certainly did. Did the priests continue to keep the Sabbath? They certainly did. Even though they did this particular work on the Sabbath, yet that didn't do away with their keeping of the Sabbath. And so, again, the critics will read this and say, I don't have to keep the Sabbath anymore. Here's the examples why. But the high priest would read this and say, oh, of course I'm still keeping the Sabbath. David would read this if for sake of, by way of explanation, by way of example, and still say, I still got to keep the Sabbath, or the bread is still sacred, right? So we have the critics interpreting it in one way, which means here are two examples why we can now break the Sabbath and we don't got to keep the Sabbath. And we have those who are actually a part of the story interpreting it another way. And so which one of the two are the right ways to interpret this? I would say it's the way that the critics are interpreting it. I'm kidding, of course. All right. Now I want you to notice this parallel here. And let me go ahead and see if I could share my screen real quick. Here it is. So what you're seeing here now, these are my notes, which you're going to see when I go ahead and post this on the description. So what you can see here is a very neat parallel between the two stories. Both of them were working the service of the Lord, both the priest and David, and the disciples in the moment of Mark chapter 2. the moment of the grain field. They were both involved in ministry. This work was sacred and it wasn't secular in both cases. Remember that the commandment doesn't forbid ministry work. Neither does it forbid anything that will hinder your health or your safety. They were both involved in that. David was hungry within his circumstances. The disciples were hungry within their circumstances. What the priest and David did is allowed and appropriate on the Sabbath. What the disciples did was allowed and appropriate on the Sabbath. Now, I want to show you something interesting. It says in these notes here, critics like Elsie use Mark 2 to promote violating the Sabbath. Yet Jesus and the disciples kept observing the Sabbath even after this incident. So if you go to Mark 6:2 and Luke 23:56, you see that Jesus and the disciples were still actively observing the Sabbath. They didn't interpret it the way the critics interpret it. They didn't interpret the issue that took place in Mark 2 the way Elsie and all these other critics do. They looked at it differently. To them, this was not an excuse for them to continually violate the Sabbath. And in case someone says, well, this was because this was before the cross, the text in Luke 23:56 takes place after Jesus dies on the cross. They never got the impression. This was 3.5 years later. I'm not saying after the grain field incident, although it could have been somewhere around that number. But for 3.5 years, the disciples never got the impression that the Sabbath would end when Jesus dies on the cross. And yet in Luke 23:56, that's what we see. It says they rested according to the commandment. Luke, many years writing this, writes it that way as well, evidently because the commandment was still in force. All right, so watch this. I gave some examples earlier of good works being done on the Sabbath that didn't necessarily break the Sabbath or do away with the Sabbath. Here we have those examples. And I want you to see these verses because this proves that even in the Old Testament, where Jesus is pulling from, even in the Old Testament, there was work that was done on the Sabbath that did not break the Sabbath, that was allowed and legal on the Sabbath because they didn't technically break the Sabbath, because the Sabbath didn't forbid this. Right? It didn't forbid this. It only forbade the secular work in the grain, the field, plowing, things of that nature. And we're going to talk about that plowing in a moment. Thank you for being here, Bobby. I saw that comment. Look at this. You have Exodus 37. The priests were to tend to the altar of incense every morning. And in Leviticus 24:8, the bread of the showbread was to be set in order every Sabbath. In 2 Kings, we learn that prophets performed their prophetic work on the Sabbath. In 2 Kings 11, we're told that the Israelite soldiers were in the service of God when they had to attend to their duties on the Sabbath. Ezekiel 46 tells us that the gateway to the inner court facing the east needed to be opened on the Sabbath. Nehemiah 13:22 says that the Levites were to guard the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Joshua 6, God commanded the Israelites to march around the city for 7 days. Of course, that would include the Sabbath. God himself did good works on the first Sabbath. Colossians 1:17, again, by way of repetition, says that all things by him consist. And so God was still doing that kind of work on the Sabbath. Yet he rested from the work of creating on the Sabbath, on the seventh-day Sabbath. And so the conclusion is that it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. That's the conclusion. It is lawful. And I'm going to prove that now by way of Bible. Now watch this. I just showed you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and prove that now. Go to Mark chapter 2. Let me go ahead and present my screen again. Mark chapter 2 now. Check this out. This is my favorite app. I recommend you download it. This is the text we're looking at, but watch this. Matthew 12:12. Of course, this was on another Sabbath incident, but the parallel is quite is very, very, very near what happened on the previous Sabbath with the grain field incident. Jesus is again doing good works on the Sabbath. Notice what he says. How much then is a man better than the sheep? Wherefore it is lawful or legal or allowed to do well or good on the Sabbath days. Everything that those priests did, that those Israelites did in those times was allowed. What David did was allowed, legal. What the priest did was allowed or legal. And therefore, what the disciples did was allowed or legal and didn't violate, didn't break the Sabbath. Neither was it an excuse for man to break the Sabbath. All right. Does that make sense, everybody? Type a 1 in the chat if that made sense. Or give me an amen. Because now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the next argument that our critic makes in this book. All right. Now that we got that out of the way, we're back in Mark chapter 2. Here's another argument that you find. And again, for those of you who arrived later, we're examining this book right here. This is an anti-Adventist, mostly anti-Sabbath book. And by way of repetition, again, for those who arrived, I have responses to almost every chapter in this book on the website. As soon as the website is back up, you'll be able to see that. So now we're going into the next one. This particular argument is very interesting because critics always cry foul to Adventists because to them, we don't examine the context. You know, you've heard these funny little phrases, context is king, and what's the other one? Context will destroy their bad doctrines. This is their go-to phrases. But it's interesting how typically the context doesn't, in most of these cases, doesn't really help their case. And in even more of those cases, it contradicts the teachings that they're trying to give. Here's what we have, Mark chapter 2. And I'm going to read to you from page, see if I could find it for you real quick. Page 9 of this book. And it goes into page 10. It says here, all right, this is the bottom paragraph, and it says, here we go. So the humanity, here we go. From these examples, and so the critic is giving a couple of examples here. It says, from these examples, we can confidently conclude that humanity is not who's being referred to here as who the Sabbath came into being for. Even though Jew or Jewish is not used to modify the man. So here we go. This is the part I want you to see. Even though the word Jew or Jewish is not used to modify man, yet contextually we can see that it is the Jewish man being referred to. And he's going to explain why, but I wanted to interject real quick. It's interesting to me how, you know, when we examine Romans chapter 14, and this particular critic really enjoys that chapter, he does tries to make a case out of it, which we'll examine soon. That chapter doesn't mention the Sabbath at all, not at all. And so, but he tries to make a case for it, including the Sabbath, right? So I see a bit of a parallel here with what's happening in Mark chapter 2 and his arguments. At some point, we're going to get to Romans chapter 14. But notice what it says, even though the word Jew or Jewish is not used there, yet contextually we can see that it is the Jewish man being referenced because everything in the focus here is strictly Jewish. Notice how it sounds convincing. It says Jewish leaders questioned a Jewish rabbi concerning the conduct of Jewish citizens who violated Jewish law, to which Jesus made a defense by citing the past and excusable behavior of prominent Jewish figures with Jewish traditions, such as the temple, the bread of the presence, the priests, so on, David and his men, the Sabbath. And so the title is The Sabbath, What You Need to Know. So basically his argument is that everything there is Jewish. And so therefore, the man in verse 27 of Mark 2 must be Jewish. This is how critics argue. This is this is how pardon they argue that because the person speaking is Jewish, is Jesus, because the examples are all Jewish, the people present are Jewish, therefore the man must be Jewish in verse 27. All right, I'm going to give you two examples of why this is bad argumentation. First example I'm going to give you is Matthew chapter 10. So watch this, Matthew chapter 10. And in fact, I'm going to share my notes so that you can see it in my notes. Again, I'm going to post these notes at some point so that you can read them for yourself. If you got your Bible, go to Matthew chapter 10. And now in Matthew chapter 10, we have a very similar situation with another ordinance, or let's say another institution is a better word, that came from the beginning as well. Watch this. 8 chapters later, in Matthew 10:7, Jewish leaders again questioned a Jewish rabbi concerning the conduct of Jewish citizens. Notice I'm using the same phraseologies, you might say, that the critic used with the Sabbath. Now I'm using it with the institution of, well, you'll see. I want to give it all away. It says, to which Jesus also made a defense using the same Greek word, man, in the Greek, by citing a verse from the Jewish scriptures and later expounding on his lesson to his Jewish disciples. What institution is Jesus talking about? Go to Matthew chapter 10 now. Matthew chapter 10, verse 7. Now notice this, Matthew chapter 10, pardon, I think there's an error there. Mark chapter 10. Okay, Mark chapter 10, and we're going to go to verse 7. It says, in fact, let's go back just a little bit. Go to verse 2. It says, the Pharisees came and asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Testing him. Reading from the New King James Version. So the institution we're talking about is marriage. Verse 3, and he answered and said to them, what did Moses command you? And he said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her. That's in Deuteronomy 24:1, by the way. Jesus answered and said to them, because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote this precept. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. So notice he's quoting now from the Jewish scriptures. Gives a Jewish example, right? It says, for this reason, the man, here we have the same Greek word anthropos, which we find in Mark 2:27. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they twain shall become one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. Who was there, by the way? Verse 10, in the house his disciples, so now we have more Jewishness, right? So look at my notes again. It says we have the same Jewish audience, same Jewish disciples, same Jewish rabbi, doing the same thing, defending. Same period of time. It didn't take too long after the Mark 2 incident for chapter 10 to come around. Same Greek word, man, same context, both of them pointing to the beginning, even though one is about marriage, the other one is about Sabbath, but yet they both point to the beginning, to creation. Same Jewish author, it's Mark. Same Jewish scriptures whereby Jesus is pointing to. Now notice, why then does the presence of everything Jewish make man in Mark 2:27 Jewish, but does not make man in Mark 10 verse 7 Jewish, where apparently everyone present there was Jewish also? Furthermore, and if the presence of Jews makes the Sabbath Jewish in the one case, why doesn't the presence of Jews make marriage Jewish in the other case? What we have here is a double standard, brothers and sisters, inconsistency. No one would say that marriage was Jewish. and it strictly belonged to the Jew, and that the marriage was made for Jews. Nobody would say that. Neither would Elsay or any critic say that, because marriage is original from the beginning and belonged to mankind. But they say that about the Sabbath, though, even though we find a high similarity in respects to the context of how they're both being used or treated. And so this is an inconsistent argument that critics would not apply to things like marriage, even though you have these high similarities, and yet they would apply it to the Sabbath. I think probably is because there's a lot of bias involved. Or perhaps, if I want to be nicer, a misunderstanding. But the presence of everything being Jewish in the one case does not make the Sabbath Jewish any more than the presence of everything Jewish in the other case makes marriage Jewish. It's very clear, and it's definitely an inconsistent argument. Now, I want to prove even more why that argument doesn't work. I want to prove even more why that argument doesn't work. So let me show you something here. If you scroll down a little bit to point D, as you can see right here, when the critic examines Mark 2, and he sees in Mark 2 everything Jewish, the critic did not examine Matthew 11 and 12, which is Matthew's version of the incident that took place. Why do I say that? Because Matthew 11 and 12 give extra details and extra information that Mark 2 does not give. And that's very important to notice, right? Sometimes there's always the example given that if two people or more see a car accident, both of them will say that there was a car accident, yet both will give details that the other did not give. And so therefore it's important for us to get information from all the witnesses. And so we're going to go to the witness of Matthew now. And in Matthew chapter 11, that's Matthew gives us chapter 11 is awesome because it sets the we can say the context. It sets the context well for what happens in Matthew 12. Notice in Matthew, and for this I'm actually going to go and show my blue letter Bible. So let me go ahead and just pull that up real quick. All right, so here we go. So in Matthew chapter 12, I'm going to make this bigger. We have, actually go back to chapter 11. In Matthew chapter 11, look at what it says in verse 20. Woe unto you, Chorazin! Woe unto thee, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Scroll down to verse 23. And thou, Capernaum, which art exalted into heaven, shall be brought down into hell. Why am I mentioning these nations? Because Jesus is evidently, or obviously, I would say, speaking to them. There were people from those particular locations present at the time when Jesus was speaking. Now, it would be quite incredible for a critic to assume that only Jews from those cities were here. But when we know that those cities contain both Jews and Gentiles, as a matter of fact, in Matthew 8, verse 5, we find somebody coming from Capernaum to Jesus who was a Gentile. And so we have both Jews and Gentiles present at the time when Jesus was speaking. So for the critic to then turn around and say, well, there were only Jews present when that took place. Not necessarily. You might be able to say the majority were Jews, but you cannot really say that it was a fully Jewish audience. I would say that in both cases, be it in Matthew 11 and Mark 2, and also in Mark 10 with the marriage situation, there were both Jew and Gentiles present. Jew and Gentiles present. Yes, I'll make the font a little bigger, pardon. Pardon that. Thank you for bringing that up, Bobby. So if anybody's having trouble viewing the text, just let me know, like Bobby did, and I will certainly make it bigger. Um, so let me go ahead and do that now with this one. As a matter of fact, I've noticed, there you go. If I do it like that, it's a little more, you can see it better. All right, so here's a text that talks about Capernaum, and these are the other two nations being mentioned, and it would be, uh, you know, pretty crazy to say that only Jews from those places were present, right? In fact, we find situations, especially even in John, we read that certain Gentiles came and approached Jesus. And at that point, Jesus says, now it's time for you to work, glorify thy son with the glory I had from the beginning. And so that's in the book of John. But the point is that we have various individuals that follow Jesus. It wasn't just Jews, it was Jews and Gentiles. So why do I mention Matthew chapter 11, even though it's in Matthew chapter 12, that the Mark II incident took place, or the incident of the grain field took place? Because this happened on the same day. Jesus then talks about coming to him for a spiritual rest. Incidentally, he's doing that on the Sabbath. Because then in the very next chapter, if you go to the very next chapter, let's see, here we go, next chapter. Notice it says, at that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and then we read of the situation that took place. So on the Sabbath, at that time, he had an audience that he was preaching to, both Jew and Gentile. And it was at that time that Jesus talks about that spiritual rest that they were lacking while keeping the physical rest. And then he justifies what the disciples were doing. He explains what true Sabbath keeping really is. According to the book of Isaiah, it was to be a delight, but the Pharisees made it a burden. And so what we're seeing here, brothers and sisters, those who are listening live and those who will listen later, the argument that because everything in the context is Jewish, therefore the man in verse 27 of Mark 2 is Jew, the Jewish man, is I would even say a fallacious argument. It doesn't match the context, first of all. And second of all, critics wouldn't apply that to an institution like marriage, where it's treated the same way, where we have such a strong parallel between the two. That argument simply just does not work. All right, let's move on. And then we're gonna draw to a close with this final point. Here we have an argument brought up in this book. Go ahead and share my screen again. This argument seems very convincing. It seems quite convincing. And so I'm going to demonstrate why. There's a text in the Bible that says that the one who speaks first always seems right. That's kind of like the case of what's happening here. All right, hopefully you guys can see that. So here we have another argument. In this particular book that we're reading, the critic makes an argument using a text in the Old Testament that seems quite convincing to prove that the Pharisees were right and the disciples were breaking the Sabbath. He uses Exodus chapter 34, verse 21. So now let's go there. Exodus chapter 34, verse 21. And I'm going to pull it up here on my physical Bible. I always like to have a physical Bible, and hopefully you have yours. Exodus chapter 34, verse 21. Notice what it says. I'll read it in your hearing. 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. In plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. So with this particular verse, our critic says, well, the activities of the disciples were in clear violation of this particular text in the minds of the Pharisees. Okay, a couple of points here that are very important for us to notice. First, even if that were true, when studying passages where Jesus counters the interpretation of the Pharisees, we need to keep in mind that they were in the habit of misapplying the law. So even if in the minds of the Pharisees, that was the case, that they were violating this law, we have to always remember The Bible tells us Jesus, when he rebukes them, he actually rebukes them for misapplying the law of God. Go to Matthew chapter 15. They had that habit. And so what we do is we go by how the Pharisees are viewing things, forgetting that they had this problem, that Jesus had to constantly rebuke them. Matthew chapter 15, notice what it says beginning in verse 3. It says, he answered and said to them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, honor your father and your mother. So now look at what they do to the sixth commandment. And he who curses his father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me, it is a gift of God, and you need not honor your father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition, you hypocrites. In other words, they found the way to be able to still make void God's commandment when they were benefiting. So they had this problem. Are we going to take how the Pharisees interpreted the law and assume that that's the correct way? We need to keep that in mind. Second point, or next point, notice what it says on my notes. It's true that the act of harvesting was forbidden on the Sabbath, but the disciples were seeking to satisfy their hunger, and this was lawful according to Christ. We read that already in Matthew chapter 12, verse 12. So even though that's true, yet Jesus says that what they did was lawful, because the context is different. In Exodus chapter 34, it's not talking about doing those work which was necessary to satisfy your hunger. It's not talking about doing that work which was necessary for ministry. And when we say satisfying hunger, we mean in cases of emergency, right? That's a different context to what's happening in Mark chapter 2. Jesus justifies them and says that it was lawful. All right. Second point. The surrounding context in Exodus 34:21 contains nothing prohibiting such acts on the Sabbath. We just looked at that. The verse merely prohibits the secular labor of harvesting and plowing. And yes, it had to do with a particular feast. Now notice this. Third point. 4 chapters earlier, God commanded that ministry work be done on the Sabbath. You can compare that to Leviticus 24:8. So the disciples were currently engaged in ministry work. So even though we do have that in Exodus 34:21, yet in the context of this, God still said that ministry work was to be done on the Sabbath. And the disciples were currently engaged in ministry work, therefore it was lawful what they were doing on the Sabbath. But here is the most important point that I want to bring out. Here's where our critic failed completely when using this particular verse. Notice what it says in point number E. Jesus' reference to the beginning when the Sabbath was made predates the post-lapsarian ordinance of Exodus 34:21. Did you catch that? In Mark chapter 2, Jesus is pointing to the beginning, which is Genesis chapter 2. And that was before that ordinance came in Exodus 34:21. Same thing that happened with the ordinance, with the institution of marriage in Mark 10. To Jesus, the foundational principle of the Sabbath, that it was made for man's benefit, takes precedence over anything that comes afterwards. Just like how union in marriage takes precedence over the allowance of divorce, which also came afterwards. In other words, Jesus is pointing to the beginning before the Exodus 34:21 ordinance was ever in existence. Context is king. What we're seeing here is that Jesus always uses the beginning to lay his foundation and to bring out principles. Paul does that as well. Points to the beginning to lay out principles. The beginning, the creation, is always the foundation of everything. Whatever came afterwards is temporary. What was there from the beginning was eternal. That's why you find the Sabbath on the new earth. That's why you find the tree of life reinstituted on the new earth, right? Man is back in his perfect state in the new earth. And so what we have here is Jesus pointing to the very beginning, before the Exodus 34:21, making a case. And so, therefore, that which existed from the beginning took precedence over what we have in Exodus 34:21. And in the context of Mark chapter 2, in Matthew chapter 12, and also in Mark 10 with regards to marriage, these are things that existed beforehand. And so Jesus says, listen, guys, basically he's saying, listen, everything, he's saying what was in the beginning is what's most important, right? What was in the beginning is what takes precedence over everything else. And in the beginning, marriage was between a man and a woman, not a man and a woman, and then later can get a divorce. That's what matters. That's what's most important. Because of the hardness of your heart, Moses wrote that ordinance to get a divorce, meaning that circumstances caused a certain change to take place. But yet that doesn't do away with God's original intent in marriage, which was no divorce. Same thing applies to the Sabbath. The circumstance of living under sin caused by necessity God to create certain exemptions and certain laws. But that doesn't do away with the original intent from the beginning. Neither does it mean that we can now get a divorce for any reason. Neither does it mean that we can now break the Sabbath. And so this is the problem with the critics. They hail context as king, context as context as context. They don't read the context, and they don't interpret the context in the correct manner. Now, what we're going to do, there's another part we're going to do to this particular study. I hope you were blessed with this study and this devotional this morning. I try to commit to at least an hour, and we're going on an hour here, so we did pretty good this morning. But by way of recap, and then we'll pray, we learned a couple of important details. Number one, we learned that going deep into the context, this is just by way of repetition for those who came in later. Let me go ahead and actually share my screen one more time. Again, these notes are going to be in the description when the moment comes for us to for me to edit the video, and then you can go ahead and pull from those notes, make your own notes as well. So what did we learn? First thing we learned is that within the context, nothing in it allows or now says that the Sabbath can be violated, even after Jesus dies on the cross, according to Luke 23. Within the context, we learned that with the two examples of David eating the showbread and the priests working good works on the Sabbath did not prohibit philanthropy. It did not prohibit helping others. It did not prohibit cases of emergencies, and it did not prohibit ministry work, all of which the disciples were engaged in at the moment when the grain field incident took place. The bread still remained sacred. The priest's work still remained sacred. All of them were still keeping the Sabbath. None of this says the Sabbath cannot be broken. Nobody can look at David and the priests and say, well, since they broke the Sabbath, I can break it. They weren't breaking the Sabbath. Here's the parallel between what the disciples did and the priests and David did. We also learned that there were many cases in the Old Testament when good works were done on the Sabbath day. And none of it meant that the Sabbath was being broken or violated, or that the Sabbath had now come to an end because of it, or would come to an end because of it. From the very beginning, God had permitted good works on the Sabbath. And so therefore, Jesus says it is lawful to do well or to do good on the Sabbath day. And he's saying that because that's always been lawful according to the Old Testament scriptures that he's quoting from. We learned also that everything in the context of Mark 2, even though it was indeed a Jewish rabbi who was speaking, there were Jewish people there, the disciples were Jewish, the scriptures he's quoting from were Jewish as well. Even though I was Jewish and it's true, that doesn't necessarily prove that the man there must be Jewish as well, any more than everything Jewish surrounding the context of marriage in Mark 10 means that marriage was made for Jewish men and Jewish women. And so that argument simply doesn't work. Furthermore, in both cases, I believe there were more than Jews present anyway. And you can see that by way of the context of Matthew chapter 11, which is right before Matthew 12, and it all happened on the same day on the Sabbath. where in the context we find people from other nations or other locations that were not always completely Jewish. And we learned of an example of a Gentile coming to Jesus from Capernaum to give evidence that there were also Gentiles there. Well, that's kind of obvious. One thing we forgot to mention was, and I kind of skipped over this, but you know what? Let me just go through this because this will be easy and quick. The part about profaning the Sabbath, but let me just give the last point in regards to Exodus 34:21. Here we have an incident that our critic likes to say or points to in his book, where what the disciples did were prohibited in the minds of the Pharisees. But here we learned that the Pharisees, first of all, misapplied the commandments of God, the law of God. Jesus constantly had to correct them. And within the context, we find various things that point to the beginning. And so Jesus is pointing to the very beginning as the foundation before the particular ordinance in Exodus 34:21. Let me finalize with this portion here. For some reason, in my mind, I thought that that was coming up on part 3 next week, but it's actually here. In Mark and in Matthew, we find that it uses the word profane the Sabbath, right? That the priest profane the Sabbath. So let's go there real quick and then we'll pray. Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12, verse 5. It says, "Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" With this verse, critics like to say, well, you see, they profane the Sabbath. And the conclusion, therefore, is that, well, now we can profane the Sabbath. We can do whatever we want with the Sabbath. The Sabbath is under our control. That's the argument that Elsey gives in his book. You know what's interesting about this? And I'll read you from my notes here. According to the Old Testament, from which he was actually quoting from, where Jesus was actually quoting from, it was actually wrong to profane the Sabbath. Look at what it says in Ezekiel 22. "You have despised my holy things and profaned my Sabbaths." God was mad at them for profaning the Sabbath. Profaning was not a good thing. Nehemiah 13 mentions it too. It says, "Then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said to them, what evil thing is this that you do, by which you profane the Sabbath?" Jesus would not quote from the Old Testament to say that it's okay to profane the Sabbath, while that same Old Testament says it's not okay to profane the Sabbath. Obviously, the Old Testament cannot at the same time condemn and encourage Sabbath keeping. So therefore, what do we mean? What does Jesus mean when he says they profane the Sabbath? Well, because Jesus had this habit of speaking in a hyperbolic sense, hyperbolic way, right? We call that hyperbole. He's exaggerating the situation in the eyes of the individuals who are listening to him by speaking this way, sort of like how Jesus says, if your right eye causes you to sin, cut it out. It's better for you to enter into the kingdom with one eye than to enter into hell with both eyes. It does the same thing with one arm, and so on and so forth. To explain to demonstrate how the Pharisees viewed the situation in their minds, sure, it seemed as if Jesus was profaning the Sabbath and the disciples. But according to the scriptures, which Jesus would not contradict, I would hope the critics agree that Jesus would not contradict the scriptures. They weren't profaning as in violating the Sabbath. They were doing something that in their view, it seemed as if it was wrong, but it wasn't. So Jesus was speaking hyperbolically to the Pharisees. He was profaning the Sabbath, but the Lord, he was magnifying and honoring the law, according to Isaiah 42:21. So Jesus was not profaning as in breaking the Sabbath at that moment. Neither were the disciples. Rather, according to the prophetic verse in Isaiah 42:21, Jesus wouldn't come to profane the law, but rather he would magnify the law and make it honorable. These are things that the critics read on the surface, but it doesn't occur to them to go to the rest of scriptures like Ezekiel 22, Nehemiah 13 to get a broader, a bigger understanding of what's happening here. And that's the issue that I find when I read the criticisms and I hear and watch the criticisms of our critics. They're not doing a deeper study. It's a very surfacey reading, and then they go off and say context is king. So That being said, we learned now that Jesus was just speaking in a way for them to, in a way that it seemed to them as if the Sabbath was being broken, but it wasn't. He was just explaining to them what actually was taking place in this particular situation. And so, reading the context carefully, studying these things carefully, we learn that what Jesus does in Mark 2, when he defends the actions of the disciples, is basically setting the record straight. He's explaining what the Sabbath was meant to do, what it was always meant to do. It was always meant to be a delight. It was always legal to do right on the Sabbath, be it ministry or be it works of necessity. He uses biblical examples to demonstrate that. And so that's what Jesus does with the Sabbath throughout all of the New Testament. Everything he does and teaches about the Sabbath is the original intent of the Sabbath. The Jews, particularly the leadership at that time, they had twisted the Sabbath to make it mean one thing. They turned it into a burden, but it actually meant another thing, and it was supposed to be a rest, a true rest. At some point, we'll have a Bible study on that spiritual rest, what the Sabbath represents. And the critics may be surprised to see that I actually agree with them in much of that. We'll save that for the future. But I hope that the study was a blessing to you. And if you don't agree, that's okay. We can agree to disagree. But at least you learned something new. And you learned how an Adventist such as myself would respond to many of these criticisms. Thank you for joining us. If there's no questions I know there was one question about which book we were looking at. I did answer that question. I'll put it again. This is the book that we're looking at. And we're examining it carefully, looking at it carefully. And so we're gonna do a part 3 on that as well. Just give me a few days. We typically try to do these morning devotionals Sabbath mornings, but yesterday morning was quite difficult for me to get up, if I'm going to be very honest with you. So, what's interesting is the alarm, I don't think I set it up right. Anyway, we'll try to meet again next Sabbath morning. We'll do part 3 about this, because we're going to look at, let me give you a little bit of a cliffhanger. In part 3, we're going to look at the critics uses the word also in Mark 2:28 to say that Jesus was saying that he's Lord of all days, the Sabbath also all the other days. He's actually right about that he is Lord of all days. But I think he's wrong about the reason why the word also was used there. So we're going to look at that. And we're also going to look at the Sabbath being a sign between God and the Jews. One critic in the comments section at the other video said that the word man in Mark 2:27 must be Jews, because the Sabbath was Jewish, because the Sabbath was a sign between God and the Jews. We're going to look at that as well on the next one. And then we're also going to look at circumcision. Another critic has said that Jesus says if he was speaking to Gentiles in Mark 2:27, he would have required of them circumcision first. We're going to look at that too. We're going to look at all these arguments. Adventists are not afraid of these arguments, of these criticisms, especially the ADL. We're ready to confront all these criticisms and critics and look at all of this. So join me on the next round as we study further into Mark chapter 2. And then we have a surprise. We're going to do a very important response to a particular critic in one of our upcoming devotionals. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and I will see you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining me. I will see you on the next round. God bless you. And if you have any questions that I didn't get to on the live, type it in the comment section right there. Just put it in, and I'll get to it when I can, either in text or in video. I'm not a fan of typing responses. Some critics think I'm hiding from them or something. I don't always respond to them in text. Please. I have a family, a business, and a ministry. I can't be behind a computer typing all the time or on my phone, but I will do videos. So please put your questions there. I'll try to get to them in text. If not, we could also make videos on them as well. I also have a strong team that helps out as well with the ministry, who are able to answer questions better than I actually. So Thank you again. God bless you, and see you on the next round.